What's up, Ascenders? This is episode 4 of Awaken with John Prendergast. Here's what's coming up.
Whenever we believe a falsehood, there's actually a contraction on a subtle level in our body and also a negative emotional reaction. So they feed on each other, and we interpret that as meaning something about our essential nature. So the main thing here is to recognize that regardless of our beliefs and emotional reactions and somatic contractions, we are already whole.
Welcome to Awaken. I'm your host, Brian Henry. And if you've been with me for the last few episodes and you're wondering, yes, I have changed the name of the show. Moving forward, it will no longer be named The Ascend Show, but the mission still stays the same. Our mission on Awaken is to propel humanity in the direction of universal growth. And we do this by having on special guests of the show who will share with you valuable experience and wisdom to help you attain a greater state of health, live on a higher plane of consciousness, and manifest abundance in your life. In this episode, I'm speaking to a man named John Prendergast, and John falls under the category of a type of person that I very much enjoy learning from, and that's someone that found themselves on a life path on which spirituality and science intersected. You see, from a very early age, John was living a life of spirituality, and then he grew into a scholar of psychology. He taught as a psychology professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and now he's retired as a professor, but working as a psychotherapist. And psychotherapy is a field that I'm very interested in because I think there's so much that can be learned from the many different approaches and strategies within the field of psychotherapy that we can take and use to better our own lives. So going into it, I was pretty excited to talk to John. And the topic that we focused on was one that's at the core of his psychotherapy approach, and that's getting people in touch with their true selves. So he refers to the topic as inner knowing, and it parallels the idea and concept that I hold true to my heart, and it's the idea of intuition, and intuition being a internal compass of sort to guide you along this path. So I thought, what better way to introduce these ideas than to have someone who for a living and for many years has been helping people get in touch with their true selves. And the topic runs a lot deeper than you think at the surface of it. So the insights that John shares in this episode is very valuable in my opinion. So I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Let's jump into the interview. Hi, John. Welcome to Awaken. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Nice to be here, Brian.
So before we get started and we kind of dive into the topic that I want to spend most of our time addressing, why don't we allow our listeners to get a little bit more of a background on who you are and kind of the work you do. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the story that led you into the work that you're doing and kind of the approach that you take with your work?
Well, it's a long story, I would say. I'll see if I can boil it down.
Sure.
When I was a boy, this is a fateful beginning, but between the ages of 10 and 13, when I would be falling asleep, I would find myself quite spontaneously entering into very expanded states of consciousness, and I had no idea what was going on. I just felt myself felt like my body was becoming infinitely large and small, and it was completely off the map in terms of anything I'd read or heard about, and I kept the experiences to myself. And then at the beginning of puberty, with the onset of hormones, those experiences stopped, and I forgot all about them. Mm-hmm. But I felt myself drawn to an interior life. That's the best way I can say it. And so I was in my late teens beginning to read more in Eastern contemplative traditions, and autobiography of a yogi made a big impression on me. So I began meditating when I was 20 years old. I practiced TM and actually became a teacher of that because I found...
to jump in right there, TM, just for those that may not know, is Transcendental Meditation, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay,
So I practiced TM, I became a teacher, and then left that organization, but I was definitely following a deep inner calling, and continued my own form of meditation, and was interested in finding a teacher who could help support and guide me, and that led me to India and more depth of investigation. I met my main teacher, Jean Klein, who was a European master, spiritual master in 1983, so that's almost 35 years ago, and I felt an immediate rapport and connection with him, and he began to really clearly point to where my own understanding was obstructed, I would say, how I was identified with certain beliefs of who I was, defining and confining myself. And meanwhile, I was getting a doctorate, a master's and a doctorate in clinical psychology, and also beginning to supervise and teach. So there were two kind of parallel tracks going on. One is a continual deepening in my own self-inquiry and meditation, and another was the developing of working with people, helping them from a more transpersonal orientation to get in touch with their own knowing. So these were parallel tracks of really attuning with a deep inner knowing, and they gradually merged. I couldn't distinguish my psychotherapy practice from my spiritual investigation. And that's just, I met my first teacher died in 1998, and the year later I met Adyashanti, who I studied with intensively from 2001 to 2006, and that led to a series of openings and a deep kind of letting go and trust in being, and a deep inner knowing. And so I've been sharing that in my work individually, and more recently in groups and residential retreats, and of course it's the main topic of my book, In Touch.
So do you mind diving a little bit more into kind of what that teachings looked like when you were working with the spiritual teachers? I'm sure that there was probably quite a bit that you guys covered, but maybe some standout moments in terms of what you would do with them, what sort of practices they would have you go through.
Well, I'll go through them quickly. I mean, as I mentioned, my first introduction to meditation was TM, and I felt, it's an effortless mental repetition of a mantra, and I just felt myself immediately sinking into a very, very deep state the first few times that I meditated, and so of course that caught my attention. So 10 years of basically daily meditation with TM definitely quieted the mind and brought easy access to silence. But there was still a sense of inner separation, of a separate meditator who was meditating. And that wasn't, in that tradition, the TM tradition, that wasn't really pointed to in a clear way. So when I met my teacher, Jean Klein, this is what he was pointing to immediately. And it's more in the form of self-inquiry. It's like investigate the nature of the apparent meditator, the apparent perceiver, this apparent separate self. And it's very interesting. This is called self-inquiry. When attention turns inward towards the one who is aware, it's like the walls fall off, the bottom falls off, the roof gets blown off. And, there are many experiences of just a tremendous openness and simplicity of being, but with no one, not belonging to or referring to anyone. So there is a series of these glimpses, I would say, of awakening to one's true nature. And when I studied on retreat with Adyashanti, who's a younger Californian teacher, not so young anymore, but at that time, 20 years ago, there's a very clear and radiant sense of presence and openness in being with him, and that really catalyzed a similar discovery within myself that was quite spontaneous. So now my practice, such as it is much less formal. It's much more informal. It's much more resting in awareness, resting in this which is always here, and knowing this is who I really am. I have an identity, I have a name, and I have roles that I play, and I have a personal history, but none of it actually defines who I am. It's an expression of who I am, but the senses of knowing myself as consciousness itself, and that brings a tremendous freedom. It actually frees one's individuality to be as kind of quirky and creative and alive, as one can be. So It's just kind of opening now. It's much more about creative expression and aliveness and a sense of richness in life.
Right, nice. Right. I definitely like the way that you describe dissociating from that sense of self in the book specifically, and I think that sort of understanding is one that will make way for better understanding some of the other things that I kind of want to address.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
could you kind of dive into a little bit more about that importance of dissociating from that self identity that we create for ourselves, and why is it even important to do that in the first place?
Okay, so first of all, I would use a word a little bit different from dissociate, because in psychology, dissociate is avoidant.
Okay,
in other words,
yeah, nice. You're going there, yeah.
You're avoiding something because of shame or fear, and so there's a kind of internal splitting or separation.
Mm-hmm.
And the process that I'm talking about, I think more accurately would be called disidentification.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what you're referring to, I know. And it means seeing through our limited identities. And generally, we're very identified with certain beliefs about who we are. And sometimes they're conscious, and very often they're subconscious or right on the level of consciousness. For instance, there may be, a very simple, deep feeling that I'm lacking something essential, or that I'm flawed. These are generally the two, I find, constellating core beliefs that tend to drive us, and they're often formed in childhood based on our experience, and it seems inevitable that we are conditioned this way to some degree. And so it's almost like living with, kind of living in a fog, or living with glasses on that are, dark and obscured, and so we actually don't see very clearly. We see through very limited vision of lack or flaw, or we compensate for that, and we have a grandiose image of ourselves. But they're both defenses, and neither one of them really are accurate reflections of who we are. So in the process of disidentification, we see, I have this belief about myself being lacking or flawed or being separate, and I see with utmost clarity it's not true. And it's like a shedding of a veil. It's an unveiling process. And so the result is, it's very interesting working with these beliefs, because they're very associated with reactive feelings and bodily or somatic contractions. Whenever we believe a falsehood, there's actually a contraction on a subtle level in our body, and also an intense or sometimes subtle negative emotional reaction. And so it's a complex, and they feed on each other. We have these emotional reactions, and then we think, something's wrong with me, or we feel a knot of contraction in our belly or in our heart or our throat, and we interpret that as meaning something about our essential nature. So the main thing here is to recognize that regardless of the conditioning that we've gone through, regardless of our beliefs and emotional reactions and somatic contractions, we are already whole on the level of essence. And so the disidentification process is the discovery of our native wholeness regardless of our conditioning. And as we discover that experientially, not as a philosophy, but as a direct experience, a direct knowing within ourselves, it's very liberating. It gives us a lot of space then to be accepting and compassionate towards our own conditioned experience, and that provides an optimal environment for that to unfold and integrate as well. So it supports the transformational process. So disidentification, the letting go of who we think we are and who we feel we are, creates an open space for us simply to be who we are, and also for our conditioning to transform and be more aligned with that.
Right, nice. And I think so I think you did a really good job there of just kind of differentiating the word that you chose to use, disidentify, and the word I chose, dissociate, which I probably won't ever use again. But I definitely see kind of where you're coming from with regard to that dissociation being. Would you say that it can kind of get in the way of that process of disidentifying?
Yes. Absolutely, because when we dissociate, we're just, we're trying to escape from something. And part of the psyche actually splits. It leaves the body. It's very interesting. So dissociation is a very common phenomena when the system is overwhelmed with trauma, for instance. It just becomes unbearable to be here. It's just overwhelming. And so there's a very kind of natural, intelligent response to split from our experience. And we actually, in some way, leave our body. We don't feel fully here. We go into fantasy, we dull our awareness so we're not actually in relationship. And all of it is a defense so that we're not overwhelmed and hurt as well. So when we're not all here, it's actually, it gets in the way. It makes it more difficult actually to meet our experience as it is, to see our experience as it is, to feel our experience as it is, and to see through it, right? Because we're too far away from it. We need to be intimate with our experience. We need to feel it and sense it and see it very clearly in order to see through it. And if we're at a distance, if we're fearful of our experience, if we're ashamed of our experience, it makes it more difficult to be intimate with our experience and therefore to, in a very natural way, disidentify from it.
Right. Yeah, no, I see that a lot in people that may be involved with a spiritual practice where and I think I even see it more so in people that again, engage in spiritual practices, because I think what tends to happen is, I think a lot of times people see that concept of being the watcher of your thoughts or being the watcher of your emotions, and then they almost kind of they start to identify as the watcher, and then again that kind of leads into that dissociation with how you're feeling and how you're being. And I think it comes back to a concept, and I think you might have written about this in the book, spiritual bypassing. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I could. First of all, I really appreciate your insight, because I think this is it's very common what you describe, and it even seems to be encouraged and prescribed by some contemplative traditions to simply kind of be a watcher of your experience, and then that becomes an identity, right? Now you're separate from your experience as a watcher, and it creates a kind of it can create a coolness, a detached quality, a disembodied quality, and people get stuck there. People who've been meditating actually for many years, regardless of the contemplative meditative practice that they have. So it becomes a form of avoidance, subtly, of actually feeling and being in relationship. And this is when people speak about spiritual bypassing, this is what they're referring to. It's like using basically concepts and in some cases certain states of experience that meditation will provide in order to avoid intimacy with their feeling and vulnerability and relationship. And so they skip over or they bypass very important areas psychologically, that may have been where we've been wounded, neglected or abused early on. It was just too painful to deal with. And we're trying to rise above it, So personally, though, again, I'm going to reframe the term spiritual bypassing because I've given it some thought, and I don't think it's quite the right word, although it's used commonly and you're using it accurately. But it's actually the idea of spirituality that people are using to avoid their experience. It's not spirituality itself.
Right.
Because my understanding of spirit is actually that which is sort of the ground of everything and also the substance of everything. So it's the essence.
Could you actually just repeat that? I like that.
Yeah, spirit is the ground and substance of everything. So it's from which everything comes, and it infuses everything. It's that which everything is made out of, or the substance of everything. The second point is very important. This is because in spirituality, one point is spirit is transcendent. It's not limited to form. It's not limited to the body, feelings, or thoughts. And you have contemplative traditions that say you're none of those, right? They're pointing to your formless, pure, your nature is pure consciousness. That's step one. But step two is to realize spirit infuses everything, that everything is made up out of that, including your thoughts and your feelings, your sensations. So to say I'm not the body is actually only a helpful step initially. More accurate is to say I'm not just the body. I am this body, and I am so much more, right?
And I think
so, yeah, go ahead.
that tends to be a first step, like you mentioned, right? Even though it might not be fully or completely accurate, I think that that initial realization where people, like you said, would say, I'm not the body, that can lead way into a deeper understanding, which like you're saying, involves understanding that, well, the body is within what you'd call spirituality.
Yes, that's right. It's within it. So the sense is, it's like when this is part of the disidentification. It's like, okay, so if I'm not, not just this body, not my thoughts, not my sensations and feelings, then what am I? And we begin to discover this sense of just pure open awareness. And that first step of realization, we could say, I am no thing. I am not an object. I am just this openness, right? This kind of pure awareness. But we're still in a duality. We're still in a slightly separate state. It's like, okay, I know myself as open awareness, but what is this? Everything else that I experience. And so that's the next step, is to realize, oh, I am this too. I am nothing and I am everything. And that's kind of wisdom and love together.
All right, nice. Okay, so what I want to do here, John, is to take a little bit of a step back, just in case some of the ideas and concepts that we're sharing here isn't just passing over the head of some of the audience.
Good idea.
So he used the word open awareness. Can you just go into a little bit about, well, what do you mean by open awareness? And let's try to approach it from the approach that someone's coming to you with little to no understanding of maybe some of these ideas, and you're trying to help them better understand this idea of accepting our truth as being this unbounded awareness.
Okay, so what I would say to someone, and to your listeners as well, is that your experience is made up basically of three components. It's made up of sensations, like in this moment, there's the experience, if your eyes are open, of visual phenomena. It's made up of tactile sensations of touch. It's made up of sounds, listening to my voice and your voice, Brian. And there may be tastes and smells as well. So that's the sensate aspect of your experience. You may be having emotions right now of various kinds, and if not now, at other times, and which is a kind of particular kind of sensation, and we feel those in our body. So that's another aspect of our experience. And we have thoughts. We're thinking in words. We may have images. We have memories as well. So really, a mix of sensations and feelings and thoughts makes up our experience. But we always say, when we talk about our experience, we say, I am aware. I'm aware of my sensations. I'm aware that I'm, seeing something right now and hearing something right now, touching something right now. I'm aware of my feelings, right? I'm aware of being happy or sad or angry or confused or whatever those feelings may be. And I'm aware of thoughts as well. And usually thoughts we're less aware of because they're so subtle and quiet, but they're basically self-talk. It's voices that we hear within our mind. So in each case, we say, I am aware. So that's what's foundational to experience, actually, is regardless of what the objects of awareness are, there's always awareness as a quiet background or ground of experience. And so the invitation to your listeners is actually to notice, okay, awareness is here regardless of experience, and to actually turn attention back to awareness itself.
Okay.
So that generally is a movement towards silence. It's like, okay, just rest as awareness. Rest as this which is aware. It's not a doing. It's more of a kind of a relaxing and a falling back into this awake silence.
All right. Interesting. I like how you again describe it, and I wanted to ask you to, because like I mentioned when I was reading the book. By the way, we need to at least mention the title of the book here. The book that we're referring to is John's book, In Touch: How to Tune into Inner Guidance of Your Body and Trust Yourself. And much of what we're discussing here is ideas that are within the book. And like I was saying, as I was reading it, I enjoyed the way that you described this truth and this way of disidentifying from the sense of self, and it is something that that gets mentioned quite a bit, but of course it's not always the easiest concept to understand. So I did definitely wanted to hear you describe it yourself there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's move into the next topic that I wanted to address, and that's the basically the topic that you that the book revolves around, and it's what you call inner knowing. I personally like to use the word intuition, and I think they point towards the same thing there, and it's definitely a topic that I love to discuss. But let's hear it from you, John. How would you define the term inner knowing?
I think it could be used interchangeably with intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Intuition, I think the technical definition of intuition is inner knowing. That's kind of the Latin root of the word. So it's a direct, non-conceptual knowing. And it can be a knowing of something, in other words, in a very simple daily way. It's like a knowing, is this work really what I want to be doing? Is this relationship really authentic and alive and appropriate for me? Is this way of seeing, does it feel really vibrant and authentic to me? So it can be about, how we act in the world in important areas. And it can also be an inner knowing of who we really are. In other words, the knowing of our true nature. And I mentioned both. Both of these are important because we are multidimensional as human beings. And so for me, intuition can come through different channels or forms. It can come as a direct knowing. We just sometimes know something. By definition, too, intuition is accurate. Sometimes what we call intuition are actually hunches based on our fear and desire. So I wouldn't call those intuitions. Intuitions are actually by nature accurate, accurate inner knowing. So we can have it can take many of these different forms, and so it can be a direct knowing. It could come as an image that suddenly and spontaneously arises. It can come as a quiet inner voice. It can come as a bodily sensation. And this last point, as a felt sense, is the one that I actually accent in my book, because the book is really about the sense of inner knowing. Mm-hmm. And what's been very interesting for me working with people really for decades now doing in-depth work is that when people hone in on what's authentic and really true for them, something happens in the body that's very interesting if they're sensitive, and if there's not too much conditioning in the way. And I find people actually, everyone has this capacity to varying degrees, but when people begin to hone in on the truth, there's a sense of aliveness that comes in a very core of the body. There's a deep relaxation that can happen. There's a sense of relief and kind of a letting go and deepening into the ground. There's an opening of the heart. We just feel warmth in the heart that opens, and we feel more spacious as well. All of this on a subtle level and kind of a subtle somatic level, but all of these are indications that we're actually honing in on something that's not untrue, but actually very true, very alive, very vibrant, and very relevant, to our situation. So a lot of my work with people is actually helping them trust themselves, to realize actually they have the inner knowing within themselves, and that it's trustworthy, and to learn how to listen to it, and trust it and act on it.
Nice. And I definitely want to look a little bit deeper into to that somatic and bodily component of this, because I think that when I hear about those things, I see that as the the way that someone can really start to connect with these ideas, because it's things that we have all experienced, and when you can really start to describe those physical sensations that you're referring to, that's when I think people can still, for the first time, see the connection between that those sensations and this inner knowing. So you mentioned the four that you come back to with regards to the physical sensations that you feel when you're in alignment with that inner knowing. Unfortunately, I think the average person will be able to relate more to the counterparts to that.
Yes, good point.
So why don't we go a little bit into that? What are those sensations that people feel as a result of not being in line with?
Very good. Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. Yeah, so what I was describing before is when there is a resonance, right? It's almost like the subtle aspect of the body is like a tuning fork, and we hone in our understanding, and the body vibrates in resonance with that, and that gives us a clue. But similarly, and this is the opposite polarity, I love this question, is we have the experience of inner dissonance. In other words, we feel out of accord with our truth. Now, what does that feel like? Well, different for different people, of course, but there's kind of a sense of something being off deep in the interior of our body. It's like just something doesn't feel right. We feel out of accord, incomplete, like we've missed the mark in some way, which interestingly is the definition, the original definition of sin, is missing the mark. So it's not judgmental in any way. It just means that we're off. We're out of alignment as well. So somatically we can feel it as a kind of agitation, a sense of being off balance. We may feel it as a kind of a gripping. Usually it comes as a grip, a gnawing or gripping feeling in the heart area or in the gut or elsewhere in the body. So those are some of the signs that we're not listening and we're not aligned, and they become invitations then to slow down and really be with our experience. It's like, something feels off here. Instead of just rushing on, we actually slow down and say, okay, so this is like feedback coming from my body that something is off. And so I'm willing to feel it more. And this is also so fascinating to me. If we're really open to the dissonance, the sense of contraction or being off balance or agitated, and breathe into it and welcome it and become curious, like, not trying to make it go away, but actually become intimate with it. Like, what's in the very center or core of this? It begins to unfold, and we begin to actually come into alignment. So it's part of our feedback system, actually.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great point, that it's you can find benefit in tuning into those feelings. While yes, they may not be, they might be irritating or agitating, like you said. They're happening for a reason, and if you tune into them, they hold information, right?
Absolutely, they're meaningful. And it's interesting, as you and I speak, Brian, I just I can feel your heart, and I can feel the sense of inner alignment too. It's like there's something resonant here in our conversation, isn't there? Right? There's something felt to be true. So it's something we feel within ourselves, and it's something that we can feel in between ourselves and another. We can be with someone and something can feel off, and we don't quite know what it is, but we can take it as information and maybe begin to say, I don't know what it is, but it feels like something's in the way here. So it's true intrapersonally that these can be, our experience of dissonance can be a portal to greater self-intimacy, and it's true interpersonally as well. If there's a sense of dissonance or discord, we can slow down and be curious, and not challenging, but just affectionate in our exploration as well. And often it will unfold, a dimension of experience that's important to bring to awareness.
Nice. So let's carry back to inner knowing, and let's kind of try to build a process here for the listeners that can help them tap into it. Where do we begin, John? Where do we begin with trying to make our way through the noise? And let me clarify there. How do we know that what we're hearing is our inner knowing and not something like a more superficial desire? Like, how do we differentiate between those two things?
Okay, good question. How do we differentiate our inner knowing from desire or from fear? These are the two kind of main sources of noise in the system that make it more difficult to decode the clear signal of our knowing. So just to clarify, our inner knowing generally is very quiet. So it's not shouting at us, and it's not judgmental. It's very accepting and very patient. It doesn't actually have an agenda to change us. So immediately we can begin to discern the difference between, say, the judging mind or our emotional desires, and something much quieter as well. It's not an analytic process either, and it doesn't grasp and it doesn't push away any particular experience. So it doesn't assert or deny. That's why it's often referred to as that kind of still small voice within. And another clue I can offer is if we go up into our heads, into the forehead, the cerebral cortex, into our thinking, strategic, analytic mind, we're not going to find our inner knowing. We'll just find our thinking mind. And that's, it's weighing risks and benefits, pros and cons. So our inner knowing is not involved in that process at all. It's not, there may be a secondary process where we have an intuition or an inner knowing, and then we check out our, rational analytic, check it out with our rational analytic thinking, and it makes sense, then we'll go ahead and act on it. But the source of it actually tends to come from the heart area and also from the gut. So it's down in the torso. So that, I hope, clarifies somewhat, the distinctive nature of inner knowing. Now, secondly, in order to access it means we need to be quiet, means we actually need to stop. And it means that we need to recognize the limitation of our thinking and our beliefs, and to sit in a space of simplicity and of not knowing. So I often tell my students, don't know, right? Become comfortable with not knowing, right? Don't know, don't need to know. So immediately that's a prescription for the problem-solving mind to relax. Another way to approach it is to ask yourself, is there a problem I need to solve right now? The right now is very important. Like, do I need to solve a problem right now? And if I don't right now, I can put that functioning of the mind down and just be more quiet. So that's a step. And then another important step is like, let your attention fall into the heart area, right? You can breathe as if you're breathing directly into the heart area. And ask yourself the question, what's my deepest knowing, about this, whatever the this is. It may be about your true nature as a human being. It may be about another person or a particular situation. What's my deepest knowing? And you can even put your hand over your heart area. Breathe a little bit, get quiet. Know that you're not asking your thinking mind, right? You're entering into a dialogue with a much quieter, wiser, loving intelligence. And so you're quiet and you're humble and you're open. And what's my deepest knowing about this? And then you let go of the question. It's like dropping a stone into the pond. You just feel, you just sense. And often within, a minute or two, some kind of response will come. It may not be from the direction that you expect. It may not be in the form that you're looking for. It may be a subtle shift in sensation. It may be a feeling, an inclination, to move one way or the other. But it's not insistent as well. And, if it's not clear to you, you can ask another question, a clarifying question. But this is a way of beginning to open to this other way of knowing.
Awesome. So let me see if I can sum up here to establish if I'm understanding things correctly, and then you can jump in if there's anything you want to add or if there's anything I missed.
Okay.
So the big one that stands out for me is that the access of our inner knowing happens in silence and quiet. That's where I guess you need to be in order for it to arise. Another thing that stood out for me was it's not something that you go chasing after, you go looking for, you go grasping for. Rather, it's something that in that quiet, in that silence, it tends to naturally arise rather than having to be grabbed after.
Exactly.
Would you agree with that kind of phrasing?
Totally. Yeah.
Awesome. And then I want to go back to those qualities that you had mentioned earlier, that those somatic qualities, those physical sensations that one tends to feel when they connect to their inner knowing. And it was groundedness, inner alignment, open-heartedness, and spaciousness. And I think with the time that we have here, the best way to really connect with what each of those four things feels like is to go ahead and read the book. It's definitely a great read. In Touch: How to Tune into the Inner Guidance of Your Body and Trust Yourself. John, I want to thank you for your time. Is there anything that you want to leave us off with? And also, where can our listeners find you online if they want to look a little bit more into your work?
Okay. Well, what I would say as a kind of brief summary is that everyone who's listening to this podcast has this inner knowing. Okay? There are no exceptions to this. And regardless of your conditioning, it's there. It's just a matter of learning how to listen. And it's a process. So the more you listen, the clearer it gets. The more you act on your listening, the stronger it becomes. And this will become the guide, the most trustworthy guide to your life. So I wish you well in your exploration. That's to the listeners. And then in terms of if you're interested in my work, a good place to start is getting the book and working with it, and going to my website, which is listeningfromsilence.com. And I have, there's videos and audio recordings and a blog, and also I do offer, mostly on the West Coast, residential retreats. But I'm beginning to teach around the country as well. So if you're in the area or want to come to the area, it'd be great to see you at one of my retreats.
Awesome. So I will link the website and a link to the book into the show notes for the listeners there. John, again, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it, and we do appreciate you you tapping a little bit into that very important topic of inner knowing and intuition. I think there's so much that can be said with regards to where tapping into this guidance can lead you and how beneficial it can be. And you definitely did a great job here explaining, well, what is it really about, how does it feel, and how can we work towards connecting towards it. So thank you again for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I really loved the quality of your listening and your questions, Brian. It was a delight.
I appreciate that, John. Thanks again. Take care. So there it is. That's my interview with John, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And I do want to hear from you guys what you thought about this type of content, because I do take it into account when I go looking for more guests for the show. So let me know what you thought about this type of content and if you want more of it. But I definitely think that there's a lot of importance in discussing and exploring some of the ideas that John and I did in this conversation. Specifically the idea of moving beyond that story we create for ourselves and getting in touch with what and who we truly are. There's just so much that can be said about it, and there's just so much power that in truly in deepening your understanding of these ideas. So I personally want to learn a lot more about it. I know there's so much that can be said and learned from these sort of topics. But let me know what you guys think if you want to hear more about this sort of thing or not. Other than that, guys, if you want the show notes to this episode, I'm in between domains here, so I'll give you the link to the website, and then you can search it from there. The website is www.togetherweascend.com/awaken, and then you can search for episode 4 from there. Other than that, guys, thanks for tuning in again. I do appreciate the support that I keep on getting from you guys. It's been great to put out these first few episodes, and I plan to keep them coming as long as you guys are enjoying it. So thanks again, guys. Until the next episode.